Okay, so imagine this, it's 1901, and just a single company controls 90%
90%.
of the oil refining, in America.
Wow.
That's wild to think about, right? That was
Yeah.
John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil, and that's what we're going to be looking at today in this
Hmm.
deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
The rise of this company, the anxiety it generated, and the woman, Ida Tarbell, who really took it on.
Yeah, it really is a story that just completely encapsulates the Gilded Age, a time of massive innovation, wealth creation, but also a time when these huge fortunes were built on, some would say pretty shady business
Yeah,
practices.
for sure.
And, we've got so much to dive into today. We've got historical accounts, Ida Tarbell's own writings, and even some personal letters
Oh, wow.
that give us a peek into the minds of these, major players.
That's so cool. Okay, so before we get into like the rise of Standard Oil, I think it'd be helpful to kind of set the stage a little bit for our listeners who might not be super familiar with this period. Can you kind of paint a picture of what the Gilded Age was like, especially for somebody like Ida Tarbell's father, who was an independent oil man?
Sure, yeah. So the Gilded Age, roughly from the 1870s to the early 1900s, it was a time of, like super fast industrialization, economic growth.
Right.
Like picture these massive mansions, crazy parties, and these names like, Vanderbilt and Carnegie synonymous with just like obscene wealth.
Right.
But like underneath all this glitz and glamour, there was a pretty harsh reality for a lot of Americans.
Yeah.
Laborers working in like dangerous conditions, farmers struggling against these monopolies, and small businesses like those in the oil industry facing, just brutal competition.
Cutthroat, right?
Exactly.
So for someone like Ida Tarbell's dad operating, in the oil fields of Pennsylvania, what did this cutthroat competition actually look like in practice?
So imagine you're an independent oil producer in Titusville, Pennsylvania, early 1870s.
Yeah.
The oil boom has just transformed this sleepy little town into like this crazy center of activity. But then Standard Oil comes to town,
Oh,
and they introduce this scheme called the South Improvement Company.
okay.
Essentially, it was a cartel that had preferential rates from railroads.
So basically, they're getting a sweetheart deal on shipping while everyone else is having to pay these inflated prices.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about like a couple cents difference here. This was like a major cost difference that made it pretty much impossible for independent producers to compete.
Right.
They were basically being pushed out of the market, forced to either sell to Standard Oil or go bankrupt.
Oh, wow. I can see how that would create some resentment,
Oh, yeah.
especially for someone like Ida's father,
Mhm.
who built his business himself.
For sure. I mean, the outrage was huge. There were
Yeah.
protests, legal challenges, even accusations of sabotage and violence.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it was intense. One event that really stands out is what they called the Cleveland Massacre. In just a few weeks, Rockefeller bought out 22 of his 26 competitors in Cleveland.
My gosh.
It was wild. He basically gained control of like a quarter of the nation's refining capacity, just like that.
That's crazy. It
Wait,
sounds so ruthless, almost predatory.
yeah.
Was this all like a deliberate strategy?
While it's complicated, while his tactics were definitely aggressive, Rockefeller really believed he was bringing order to this chaotic industry. He thought all the competition was wasteful and destructive,
Hmm.
leading to, too much oil being produced and prices all over the place.
Okay.
He argued that this consolidation of the industry, while painful at first, would eventually stabilize the market and everyone would benefit.
So he saw himself as like a savior almost.
Kind of, yeah. Bringing stability and efficiency to a volatile industry. And to be fair, he often offered generous buyouts to those he acquired, sometimes even in Standard Oil stock, which, could make them wealthy later on.
Right.
But for a lot of independent oil men like Ida's father, it felt like they were being forced to choose.
Between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly, like accept a deal that felt like a betrayal of everything they'd worked for or risk losing it all.
Yeah, that's a tough choice. This clash of perspectives, the, independent oilmen struggling against this giant corporation, it's almost biblical, this whole David versus Goliath thing.
It really is.
And that brings us to Ida Tarbell. So how does she come into all of this?
So fast forward a few decades, Ida's become this successful journalist, one of the few women in the field at that time. But the memories of her childhood in Titusville, her father's struggles, the impact of Standard Oil on her community, it never left her. And it ultimately pushed her to investigate Standard Oil.
That must have been a huge undertaking, taking on one of the most powerful companies in the world at that time. Was she worried at all about the consequences?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
This was a time when corporations had massive power and influence. People warned her not to do it.
Wow.
They were afraid of what Standard Oil might do. But Ida wasn't fazed. She was driven by this need to find the truth, to expose what she saw as the corrupt side of corporate America.
So what was her approach? How did she even begin to tackle something this big?
What's amazing about Ida Tarbell's work is how incredibly thorough it was. She didn't just rely on rumors or, emotional appeals. She spent years traveling around, digging through court records, talking to people in the industry, and putting together this super detailed and damning account of how Standard Oil rose to power.
Wow, and she chose to publish all of this in McClure's magazine. That was a pretty popular publication back then, right?
Oh, yeah. McClure's was known for its investigative journalism, and Ida's series on Standard Oil, which ran for months, became a national sensation. People were captivated by her writing. It was detailed but engaging. She could explain these complex business practices in a way that everyday people could understand.
So she was making it real for people,
Yeah.
showing them how this corporate giant was affecting their lives.
Exactly. And this is where things get even more interesting because Ida Tarbell actually had a personal connection to Standard Oil, specifically with one of their top executives, Henry Rogers.
Okay, now this is where I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this connection.
So both Ida and Rogers were from Pennsylvania's oil country. They had developed a rapport, even a kind of friendship early on in Ida's research. Rogers, seeing her as a serious journalist, offered her this insider perspective. Maybe he was hoping to soften her view of the company a little.
So he was giving her access that most journalists could only dream of.
Hmm.
Wow. Was there a sense of trust between them?
Yeah, I think so at first. But as Ida dug deeper, uncovered evidence of espionage, bribery, all kinds of shady stuff. Things changed dramatically between them.
I can imagine.
There's this one story about a confrontation where Rogers, who is usually very calm and collected, just completely loses it.
Really?
Yeah.
What happened? What caused him to have this outburst?
Well, Ida had found proof that Standard Oil was using spies to infiltrate its competitors.
Oh, well.
And when she confronted Rogers with this information, he exploded. He accused her of betraying him, of sensationalizing the story, and of not understanding the oil industry.
Wow,
It was a turning point in their relationship. It really highlights that growing tension between Ida's pursuit of the truth and these incredibly powerful forces she was up against. It was a wild moment, and, it really shows the risks Ida was taking with this investigation. She was challenging not just a company, but like a whole way of doing business in a time when corporations had so much power.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy to think about. And her work had this ripple effect that went way beyond just business, right? Like I'm thinking about Teddy Roosevelt and that Muckraker speech he gave.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Roosevelt, even though he was a reformer himself, he was starting to get worried about how aggressive some investigative journalists were getting. Like, he felt they were blowing things out of proportion just to grab headlines.
Right.
So he used the term muckraker to criticize those who were only focusing on the negative stuff, stirring up outrage without offering any solutions.
So he was trying to make a distinction between responsible investigative journalism, like what Ida Tarbell was doing, and this more reckless kind of muckraking that could actually hurt the cause of reform.
Exactly. He believed in exposing corruption, but he was worried that too much negativity could turn people off and make real change harder to achieve.
I see. But the public reaction to his speech was kind of ironic, wasn't it?
Totally. A lot of people saw his critique as an attack on all investigative journalists, no matter their methods. The term muckraker, which was meant as like a warning label, it actually became a badge of honor for reporters who saw themselves as, fighting for social justice.
So it's like Roosevelt trying to control sensationalism actually gave more power to this new wave of investigative journalism.
You could say that. And for Ida Tarbell, her work on Standard Oil became like the prime example of this new style of muckraking. Her reporting wasn't just about uncovering wrongdoing. It was about starting a national conversation about, the role of corporations in society, the dangers of unchecked power, the need for more regulation.
Right, so she was bringing these issues to the forefront.
Yeah, exactly. And that conversation eventually led to action, right? Like the government ended up going after Standard Oil.
They did.
Yeah.
And Ida Tarbell's work, along with that other investigation by James Garfield Jr., spurred by her writing it, laid the groundwork for this massive antitrust lawsuit against Standard Oil. The case went on for years and finally made it to the Supreme Court in 1911.
It was a huge deal, a landmark case in antitrust law. The court, using the Sherman Antitrust Act, ordered Standard Oil to be broken up into smaller independent companies.
Wow, so a big win for those fighting for corporate accountability.
It really was. It was a major victory for the progressive-era reformers who'd been pushing for more government oversight of these powerful corporations.
All those years of investigation, the personal risks Ida took, it all led to this moment where one of the most powerful monopolies in American history was brought down. That's a powerful legacy.
It really is. It shows how powerful investigative journalism can be in holding these huge entities accountable and making real change happen. But there's this interesting twist to the story. Remember how Rockefeller believed he was bringing order to a chaotic industry? Well, even though Standard Oil got broken up, the funny thing is Rockefeller actually got richer because of it.
Wait, what? How did that happen? How do you benefit from your company being dismantled?
So it's because of the way the breakup happened. The individual companies that came out of Standard Oil, even though they were technically independent, they still controlled big chunks of the oil market. And Rockefeller owned stock in all of them.
Oh, I see.
So as these companies continued to do well, so did his personal fortune.
So the breakup, while important symbolically, didn't actually reduce Rockefeller's wealth or influence in the long run.
That's one way to look at it. And it raises some questions about whether antitrust laws can actually limit the power of these massive corporations. Even with Standard Oil split up, the oil industry remained very concentrated, and those individual companies still had a lot of sway.
Wow, it makes you think. So what does this all mean? What's the legacy of Ida Tarbell's investigation and the breakup of Standard Oil?
Well, for one thing, it shows us how complicated the relationship is between corporate power, government regulation, and public opinion. Ida Tarbell's work was key in changing how people thought about monopolies, and it paved the way for more government involvement in the economy.
It's pretty amazing how something from the early 1900s, can still feel so relevant today.
It is. And it goes beyond just corporations, It's
Uh-huh.
about understanding how power works in any system. And what's really interesting here is how Ida Tarbell's story fits into the whole progressive era.
Yeah.
This period, from like the 1890s to the 1920s, it was a time of massive social and political reform in the U.S.
Yeah, I remember learning about that in school. It was like everyone was pushing for change.
Exactly. And Ida Tarbell and her expose on Standard Oil were right in the thick of it. Think about everything else that was going on at that time. Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal, trying to regulate big business, protect consumers, conserve natural resources. The women's suffrage movement was gaining steam. Labor unions were fighting for workers' rights. There was this feeling everywhere that the old ways weren't working anymore and that, a fairer, more just society was possible.
So Ida's work wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was all part of this bigger movement to challenge the status quo.
Exactly. And that brings up
Yeah.
a really important question. Can individual action really challenge that kind of concentrated power?
Right.
Ida Tarbell's stories suggest that it can. Her work helped change public opinion, which led to government action and ultimately to the breakup of one of the most powerful monopolies ever.
Right.
But as we've talked about, it's not a simple victory. Rockefeller kept getting richer, and the oil industry was still dominated by a few big companies.
It's like a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line.
Yeah.
There are setbacks, unintended consequences, and even when you win a battle, the fight for a more just and equitable society never really ends.
I think that's a really important takeaway from this deep dive. The past isn't just a bunch of stories. It gives us insights that can help us deal with the complexities of our own time. Like we're seeing parallels to the Gilded Age today. Concerns about income inequality, the influence of corporations and politics, debates about regulation and the role of government. These are issues that Ida Tarbell and her contemporaries grappled with, and they're still relevant today.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what Ida Tarbell would think about the world today. What lessons from her life and her work can we apply to the challenges we face?
That's a great question. I think one of the most powerful parts of Ida Tarbell's legacy is her dedication to truth and accountability. She believed in doing your research, presenting the facts, and challenging those in power, no matter the cost. In a time when information is everywhere, but also so easily manipulated, that commitment to truth feels more crucial than ever.
It's like she was showing us how to deal with complicated issues. Do your research, be skeptical, ask the tough questions, and don't be afraid to speak truth to power. Those are lessons that never get old.
And her story reminds us that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about people, their decisions, their struggles, and the impact their actions have. Ida Tarbell's choice to investigate Standard Oil changed the course of American history, and her legacy inspires us to question things, challenge injustice, and hold the powerful accountable.